The name hit Emmett Ford like a bullet before she ever opened her mouth. He was standing at the far end of the Redemption Creek train platform, badge catching the late afternoon sun, arms crossed over his chest the way he always stood when he was trying not to look like the world had just tilted sideways beneath his boots. The 4:15 from Santa Fe had rolled in 3 minutes late, belching smoke into the already punishing July heat of 1882, and the passengers had filed off one by one: a traveling salesman, a cattle buyer from Albuquerque, 2 ranch hands heading back to the Double H spread, and then her. She stepped off that train like she already owned the platform. Dark auburn hair pinned up beneath a traveling hat that had seen better days, a dress of deep blue cotton, dusty from the journey but fitted well enough that every man on the platform noticed. A single carpet bag in her left hand and something else in her right, a folded paper, a letter, something she held like it was either a weapon or a lifeline. Her chin was up. Her eyes were scanning. Green eyes, Emmett noticed from 50 feet away, the kind of green that made you think of things that grew in places too dangerous to walk through. She was looking for someone. She just didn't know it was him. Emmett already knew her name because of what had arrived 3 days before she did: a wire from the territorial marshal in Santa Fe, short and clipped and carrying more weight than its 12 words deserved. It had read, "Matilda Morgan coming to Redemption Creek. She is either a witness or the lie. Watch carefully." He hadn't slept well in 3 days. He knew what name she carried. He knew what that name meant in certain circles, in certain dark corners of the territory's history. He knew that a man had died with that name on his lips 8 months ago, and that the man who'd killed him was currently running the most profitable cattle operation in Redemption Creek County, currently sitting on the town council, and currently smiling at Emmett Ford across church pews every Sunday morning like they were the best of friends. What Emmett did not know was which version of Matilda Morgan was stepping onto his platform. He pushed off the post he'd been leaning against and walked toward her, and the moment he got within 20 feet, she looked up and found his badge first and his face second, and something moved through her expression, not fear exactly, but the particular controlled stillness of a person who has survived enough surprises to manage their reactions. He stopped 2 feet in front of her. She opened her mouth. He said her name before she could say a word. Matilda Morgan. The way her face changed in that single second told him everything he needed to know. The chin that had been held so precisely level dropped half an inch. The green eyes went wide, then narrow, then wide again in a sequence so fast most people wouldn't have caught it. The hand holding the carpet bag tightened until her knuckles shifted color. And underneath all of it, something else, something that looked almost like relief, as if she'd been carrying a secret so long that having someone simply name it out loud was enough to unlock something in her chest. "How?" she said. Just that word, flat and careful, like a hand held up in front of a flame. "I'm Sheriff Emmett Ford," he said. "I've been expecting you. I didn't tell anyone I was coming here. Someone did." He tilted his head. "You got somewhere to stay?" Her jaw tightened. "I was told there was a boarding house on the main street. Mrs. Calloway's. It's clean, good food." He paused, watching her. "There are things you need to know before you go asking questions around this town, Miss Morgan. Things that could get you killed if you don't understand what you're walking into." She stared at him for a long moment. The July heat pressed down on both of them. A horse at the hitching post blew air through its nose. Somewhere down the street, a door banged on its frame in the dry desert wind. "You read the wire," she finally said. "I did. Then you know why I'm here." "I know what the marshal thinks you are," Emmett said carefully. "I haven't decided yet what I think." Something shifted in her green eyes then, something that looked like the particular kind of anger that comes not from being wronged once, but from being wronged so many times that you've started building walls out of it. She straightened her spine, lifted that chin back to its precise level. "What I am," Matilda Morgan said, very quietly, "is the only person in the New Mexico territory who can prove that Calvin Hearst murdered my brother." The name dropped between them like a stone into still water. Emmett Ford felt the ripples hit him square in the chest. because Calvin Hearst was exactly the man he'd been thinking about. It was now that the story truly began, though neither of them could have said so in that moment. They were too busy being afraid, her of what she'd just said out loud, him of what it meant that she'd said it. The platform was mostly empty now, the other passengers dispersed into the town, the train already building steam again to continue its run south. They were alone on the sun-bleached boards with the enormous weight of what hung between them, and Emmett Ford made a decision in that moment that he knew could cost him everything. He picked up her carpet bag. She blinked at him. "I'll walk you to Mrs. Calloway's," he said, "and you'll tell me everything. Not because I'm going to arrest you or use it against you, because you need someone in this town who knows the truth, and right now, Miss Morgan, whether either of us likes it or not, I'm the only option you've got." She studied him for what felt like a very long time. Then she said, "You'd better not be another trap." "I'm not," Emmett said, and he meant it more than he'd meant anything in a long while. They walked off that platform together into the beating heart of Redemption Creek, and neither of them could have predicted what would come next, but both of them felt it, that peculiar gravity that pulls two people toward each other when the world is pressing on them from all sides. They didn't know it yet. They wouldn't admit it for a long time, but it was already there, quiet and dangerous, growing in the space between them like something planted in the dark. To understand what Matilda Morgan had risked to come to Redemption Creek, and what Emmett Ford had been carrying alone for almost a year, you had to go back to the beginning. Matilda had grown up in the Texas Panhandle, the second child of a sheep farmer named George Morgan and his wife, Clara. Her older brother, Thomas, was 27 when he died. She was 24. Thomas had been the kind of man who wrote things down: letters, observations, records. He'd worked for Calvin Hearst as a range manager for 2 years before something changed in him, before the letters he sent to Matilda started carrying a weight she couldn't quite identify. He'd found something he'd written in his last letter to her, something she would understand the importance of, and he needed to put it somewhere safe before he sent for her. He was going to send for her in the spring. He never sent for her. What arrived instead, 6 months after that letter, was a notice from the Redemption Creek County Clerk stating that Thomas Morgan had died in a riding accident in October of 1881, and that his personal effects had been disposed of as per the custom for men with no local family. By the time Matilda received this notice, it was already January of 1882. She had spent the next 6 months doing what Thomas had always said she was best at, finding things out without anyone knowing she was looking. She had talked to people who'd worked with Thomas. She'd traced his movements through a network of connections that crossed 3 counties. She'd found a man in Santa Fe who'd been Thomas's friend, a former Army surveyor named Bart Alcott, who told her something in a hushed voice over a kitchen table that had made her blood go cold. Thomas hadn't died in any riding accident. Thomas had been seen, alive and agitated, at Calvin Hearst's Maine ranch house the evening of October 14, 1881. He'd been seen leaving. He'd never arrived anywhere else. Bart Alcott had gone to the territorial marshal with this information, which was how the marshal had learned the name Matilda Morgan and sent that wire to Emmett Ford. What the marshal hadn't done was arrest Calvin Hearst, because what Bart Alcott had seen was circumstantial, and Calvin Hearst was exactly the kind of man who'd bought enough people to make circumstantial evidence stay circumstantial. What nobody had done yet was find the documents Thomas had hidden. Matilda believed they still existed. She believed Thomas had hidden them somewhere in Redemption Creek before that last meeting with Hearst. And she believed that if she could find them, they would be enough to bury Calvin Hearst so deep no bought jury could dig him back out. This was what she carried into Redemption Creek. This was the hidden motive behind her green eyes and her precise, controlled manner, and the way she'd stood on that platform like she was braced for impact. Mrs. Calloway's boarding house was exactly as Emmett had described it, clean and warm and smelling of biscuits, and something savory on the stove. The landlady was a stout woman in her 50s with kind eyes and the practical efficiency of someone who had run a business alone for 15 years. She settled Matilda into a room on the second floor with a window overlooking the main street and a pitcher of cool water on the washstand, and she asked no questions, which Emmett privately noted was either good manners or the result of long experience with people who came to border towns carrying trouble. He waited downstairs. He sat at the small table in Mrs. Calloway's front parlor and turned his hat in his hands and thought about Calvin Hurst and what it meant that this woman had come here. He'd been suspicious of Hurst for months, longer than months if he was being honest with himself. There had been a pattern of things in the county that had bothered Emmett since he'd taken the sheriff's job 3 years ago. Small ranchers, pushed off their land by paperwork disputes that seemed to always resolve in Hurst's favor. Water rights that shifted in ways that made sense only if someone was manipulating the county records. A particular judge in the county seat who ruled with a consistency that had nothing to do with the law and everything to do with whoever was feeding him the best meals. Emmett had started collecting notes on all of it, quietly, the way a man builds a case when he knows he's surrounded on all sides and has to be careful where he steps. He hadn't had a central name for all of it until Thomas Morgan died. He'd been the one who'd gone out to investigate that supposed riding accident. He'd been the one who'd looked at the body and felt something cold move through him, because the injuries hadn't looked right for a fall from a horse. He'd written up his report with careful, neutral language, because he'd understood even then that he was in a position where showing his hand too early could get him killed. He'd kept his suspicions private. He'd kept watching, and now Matilda Morgan was in his town. She came back downstairs 20 minutes later, having washed the dust off her face and changed into a lighter dress of pale gray cotton that somehow made her eyes look even more intensely green. She sat down across from him at the parlor table without ceremony and folded her hands on the surface and looked at him with an expression that was simultaneously wary and exhausted, and something else he couldn't quite name yet. "Tell me what you know about my brother's death," she said. He told her. All of it, not the careful, neutral version, but the real one, his actual suspicions, the things that hadn't added up, the way the body had been positioned. He watched her absorb this, watched her face do that controlled stillness thing while underneath it, if you looked carefully enough, something was breaking. "I knew it," she said very quietly when he finished. "I knew it wasn't an accident. I couldn't prove it alone," Emmett said. "I still can't, not without more. Thomas hid documents," she said, "records he kept while he was working for Hurst. Evidence of land fraud, water rights manipulation, and I believe evidence of at least one other death that was made to look like an accident." She paused. "He told me in a letter that he hid them somewhere in town. He said he picked somewhere that Hurst's men wouldn't think to look. He didn't say where. He said I would know where to look." She looked down at her folded hands, which is either Thomas being clever or Thomas being foolish, depending on how you look at it. Emmett leaned back. "You two were close." The question was soft, and something in it made her look up. "He raised me," she said, the words simple and entirely devastating. "Our parents died when I was 12. Thomas was 19. He worked himself half to nothing to keep us together." She pressed her lips together briefly. "He was the best person I knew." The silence between them held something fragile and real. "We'll find those documents," Emmett said. It came out like a vow, not a plan, and they both heard the difference. She looked at him for a long moment. "Why would you risk that? Hurst must have people everywhere in this county." "He does," Emmett acknowledged. "He's got Councilman Petrie in his pocket and probably the county judge and at least 2 of my own deputies, though I've been careful about which 2. His jaw tightened. "I became a lawman because I believe in what the law is supposed to mean, not what men like Hurst have made it into." It was a simple statement, and she seemed to understand that it cost him something to say it plainly, that it was the kind of statement a man only makes when he's decided to trust someone he hasn't yet fully earned the right to trust. She nodded slowly. "Then we'll need to be careful," she said. "We will," he agreed. They sat there in Mrs. Calloway's front parlor, while the sun went down outside and turned the dust-colored street to gold. Two people who had each been carrying an impossible weight alone, and neither of them said what was also true, that, in this hour of shared purpose and shared danger, something had begun between them that was already more than strategy. Over the next several days, Matilda established herself in Redemption Creek the way a careful person does, gradually, naturally, without drawing attention to her real purpose. She presented herself as a woman who'd heard there was work to be had in the territory and was looking to settle. She took up work helping at the dry goods store on the main street, owned by a widow named Agnes Fleet who was grateful for an extra pair of hands and asked no uncomfortable questions. She was pleasant to people she met. She listened more than she spoke. She was, in other words, exactly as good at gathering information quietly as her brother had apparently been. Emmett Ford maintained a careful public distance from her. He was the sheriff. She was a new arrival. He nodded to her on the street. He occasionally stopped in at the dry goods store for supplies. Anybody watching would have seen nothing more than ordinary small-town courtesy. What nobody saw was that most evenings, after dark had settled over the town, and the saloon a block away was generating the kind of noise that covered other sounds, Emmett would come around to the back of Mrs. Calloway's boarding house and Matilda would be waiting at the kitchen door, and they would sit at Mrs. Calloway's kitchen table long after that good woman had retired, talking in low voices about what they'd each learned during the day. These evenings were the part of the story that neither of them talked about later with any degree of accuracy, because to talk about them accurately would have required admitting that the information exchange was only part of what happened in those hours. The rest of it was the gradual, inevitable unfolding of two people who recognized something in each other that they'd stopped expecting to find. Emmett Ford was 32 years old and had been sheriff of Redemption Creek for 3 years. Before that, he'd spent 2 years as a deputy in a rougher town further east, and before that he'd ranched with his family near Las Cruces, until drought and land pressure had broken the operation apart and scattered his family to various pragmatic ends. He had been engaged once, to a woman in Santa Fe who had decided, entirely reasonably, that marrying a lawman in a dangerous county was not what she wanted her life to be. He understood her reasoning. He had never stopped understanding it, which had made it easier to let go of but harder to forget. He had built a life in Redemption Creek that was shaped by duty and purpose, and almost entirely lacking in the kind of warmth that a person needs to stay whole. Matilda Morgan was 24, and had spent most of her adult life managing the small sheep operation she and Thomas had built after their parents died, and then managing its slow, heartbreaking unraveling when the Texas Panhandle dried up and the market for wool collapsed in their particular corner of the territory. She had sold what remained of the farm to fund her investigation into Thomas's death. She had, in other words, bet everything on this. She had nothing to return to except the truth, and the only plan she had for after the truth was a blank space that she hadn't let herself look at directly. These were the things they learned about each other in those kitchen evenings. They also learned smaller things, that Emmett drank his coffee black and strong and had a habit of turning his hat in his hands when he was thinking hard about something. That Matilda had a laugh that she kept carefully under wraps most of the time, a real laugh, sudden and bright, that came out occasionally when something genuinely surprised her, and which Emmett found himself going out of his way to earn. That he'd read more books than she'd expected of a frontier lawman, because the winters were long, and the town's small lending library was one of the things he'd spent his own money to maintain. That she could draw quick, accurate sketches that she used as a way of mapping and remembering things, and which were surprisingly beautiful. On the 5th evening, she showed him a sketch she'd made of Thomas from memory, and Emmett held it carefully and studied it and said, "He looked like someone worth knowing." And she looked at him over the kitchen table with something in her expression that was too honest and too complicated to be called anything simple. On the sixth evening, he told her about the judge and the land records and the pattern he'd been assembling for months, and she listened intently and then said, "Thomas wrote about a ledger. A private ledger Hearst kept that recorded all the payments made to compromise various officials. If we could find that," and Emmett said, "that's what would bury him." And they both leaned over the table toward each other without noticing they'd done it until they were close enough that neither of them moved back. "We need to find Thomas's hiding place," she said very quietly. "Tell me everything he said in that letter," Emmett said, equally quiet. "Every word you remember." She closed her eyes and recited it. The letter had been burned after she'd memorized it. She'd been careful from the start, but she had a good memory, the kind that holds language precisely, and she gave him every sentence. He listened with his eyes fixed on her face, not on what she was saying but on her, on the way she held herself even in this unguarded moment, on the particular quality of her stillness. Thomas had written, "I've found a place to leave it that's in plain sight of everyone but noticed by no one. You'll understand why I chose it when you find it. Remember what you always used to tease me about when we were young, Tilly. Remember what I could never pass by without stopping. That's where it is." She opened her eyes. "He called me Tilly when we were small, not after that. I used to tease him about stopping at every church he passed. He couldn't walk past a church without going in, even if it wasn't his denomination, even if it was just for 5 minutes. I used to say he was hedging his bets with heaven." Emmett was already on his feet. "Redemption Creek has one church," he said, "and I know every inch of it." The Church of Redemption Creek was a small, whitewashed building on the east end of the main street, serving a congregation of mixed denomination that had banded together out of the practical necessity of having any religious institution at all in a town this size. Its minister was a gentle man named Reverend Josiah Hale, who had been in Redemption Creek nearly as long as the town itself. It was dark when they reached it, past 10 at night, the street empty, the saloon noise absorbed by the distance, the stars enormous above the desert. Emmett had a key, because the sheriff always had a key to the church. It had been the agreement since before his time, the building serving occasionally as a place of safety during storms or disputes, its neutrality a kind of civic necessity. They went in quietly. The interior smelled of candle wax and old wood and something floral, probably the dried wildflowers that decorated the small altar. Emmett moved with the confidence of a man who knew this space well. He lit one of the candles near the entrance and carried it down the central aisle. Where would he have left something? Matilda breathed. Somewhere it would stay undisturbed but accessible. "The only places nobody touches except Reverend Hale are the areas behind the altar and the small storage room at the back," Emmett said. "But Thomas wouldn't have had access to those without." He stopped. "What?" She was right beside him, close enough that he could see the candlelight moving in her eyes. "The floor," he said, "under the second pew from the front on the left side. 3 years ago there was a flood that warped the floorboards. Hale had them repaired, but one section was redone differently. There's a board that lifts if you know how." He looked at her. "Thomas worked on the church repair crew. I hired the crew myself." She grabbed his arm without thinking. He felt the grip of her fingers through his sleeve and didn't move. He handed her the candle and crouched beside the second pew, found the board he meant by touch, pressed at the correct angle and felt it shift. He worked it loose carefully and reached into the space beneath. His hand found an oilskin-wrapped package. He sat back on his heels and looked up at her. In the candlelight, her face was luminous and absolutely still, and her eyes were bright with something that was grief and relief and victory all at once, and it was one of the most beautiful things he had ever seen. "Thomas," she whispered. He stood and gave the package to her. She held it for a moment against her chest, eyes closed, before she opened it. Inside was a leather-bound journal and a bundle of papers, copied land records, copied correspondence, and a sealed letter addressed to the territorial marshal in Thomas Morgan's handwriting. They spent the next 2 hours at the church, reading by candlelight, and what they found was worse and more complete than either of them had dared hope. Thomas had documented everything. Land fraud stretching back 6 years. Payments recorded in careful handwriting, dates and amounts and names, including 3 county officials and 1 federal land surveyor who'd been on Hearst's payroll. 2 deaths listed as accidents, one a former ranch hand named Decker who'd known too much, and Thomas himself included in a chilling final entry that read simply, "If something happens to me before I can get this out, Hearst knows I've been watching. He has a way of knowing things. Send this to the marshal. Make it reach someone clean." And tucked inside the back cover of the journal, small and folded, a page that looked like it had been torn from a private ledger, in different handwriting, Hearst's own hand, with names and numbers that matched what Thomas had documented from the outside. Thomas hadn't just gathered evidence from observation. At some point, he'd obtained a page from Hearst's own ledger. "He was extraordinary," Emmett said quietly, meaning it completely. Matilda pressed her fingers to her eyes for a moment. "He always was," she said, and then, gathering herself with a control that Emmett was beginning to understand was not coldness but survival. "What do we do with this?" They made a plan. It took almost another hour, because they made it carefully, accounting for the fact that sending this to the territorial marshal through normal channels meant it going through the county clerk's office, which meant a delay, which meant Hearst's paid eyes had time to see it coming. What they needed was a direct delivery, someone who could physically take the documents to Santa Fe and place them in the marshal's hand without it passing through any intermediate parties. Bart Alcott, the former Army surveyor who'd spoken to Matilda before, was in Santa Fe. He was also the one person both of them trusted fully, since he'd already taken his account to the marshal and hadn't been bought. Emmett knew a man who could get a sealed letter to Santa Fe reliably and quickly. A postal rider named Cobb who made a private run to the capital every 2 weeks, a route outside the official mail system, carrying correspondence for people who needed discretion. It wasn't strictly legal, but it was entirely trustworthy, because Cobb was one of those rare men whose personal code of honor was more rigorous than any official obligation. "Cobb rides in 3 days, Emmett said. "We seal this and get it to him. He delivers it to Alcott. Alcott delivers it to the marshal. Given that Thomas's sealed letter to the marshal is already in here, the marshal has the formal request." He paused. "While we wait, we can't do anything that would make Hearst nervous. We behave exactly as we have been. He doesn't know I'm here for this," Matilda said. "He doesn't even know who I am, presumably." "I don't want to assume that," Emmett said. Thomas knew how Hearst operates. He wrote that Hearst has a way of knowing things. That means he has someone watching and listening in town, maybe more than one person. He met her eyes. "Be careful, don't ask questions about Thomas, not to anyone, not yet," she nodded. "I've been careful." "I know," he said, and then, after a beat, "You're very good at this." It was a simple observation, and she seemed to take it simply. But there was a warmth in the way she looked at him when he said it that neither of them addressed. They left the church separately, 5 minutes apart, and Emmett walked back toward the sheriff's office in the high desert dark with the original documents sealed inside his jacket and the copies wrapped separately, and he was thinking about Matilda Morgan and what it would mean when this was over and she had no reason to stay in Redemption Creek. It was the first time he'd thought about after in terms of something he actually wanted. The next 3 days were a particular kind of slow-burning tension. Matilda worked at the dry goods store. Emmett kept his regular routines. The documents were sealed in 2 separate oilskin packets, one given to Cobb 2 mornings after the discovery in the church, the other hidden in Emmett's office in a place only he knew. Then, on the second day, Calvin Hearst walked into the dry goods store. Matilda had seen his face in a photograph Thomas had sent her once, an informal group photograph taken at a county event. She recognized him the moment he walked through the door, a tall, broad-shouldered man in his late 40s, silver-haired, with the handsome, easy manner of a person accustomed to getting what they want. He was with one of his men, a square-jawed ranch hand who stood near the door and watched the room. Hearst browsed the store with the leisurely confidence of a man who owned everything in it by right of proximity. He spoke pleasantly to Agnes Fleet about a special order of goods for his ranch. He was charming in the way that powerful men can be charming, not false exactly, but performed, a social skill cultivated and deployed rather than felt. Then he looked at Matilda. "New in town?" he asked, with a smile that went to his eyes just far enough to look genuine. "Not long arrived," she said, managing her voice perfectly, "still finding my footing." "Well, Redemption Creek is a good town," he said, "mostly good people." His eyes moved over her face with the particular casual assessment of someone who catalogs and files. "You'll find your way. I'm Calvin Hearst. I own the Crossed H Ranch south of town. Pleased to meet you," she said, and smiled at him. He bought his goods and left. She stood perfectly still for a full minute after he was gone. That evening at the back door of Mrs. Calloway's, she told Emmett what had happened, and she said, "He was looking at me in a way I didn't like. He was trying to place me." "Did you give him anything to work with?" "Nothing," she was very certain, "but he's careful, we knew that." "Cobb's already on the road," Emmett said. 3, maybe 4 days to Santa Fe. Then however long it takes the marshal to act." He was watching her face. "You're all right." "I'm fine," she said, which was true and also only part of the truth, and they both knew it. He reached out, almost without meaning to, and put his hand briefly over hers on the kitchen table. It was the first time he'd touched her deliberately, not counting when she'd grabbed his arm in the church, and it lasted only a moment of contact that said something neither of them was ready to say aloud. She looked at him and didn't look away. "Emmett," she said, and then stopped and seemed to make a decision. "When this is over, what do you do? Do you stay here?" "Yes," he said. "This is my town, my work is here," she nodded slowly. "I don't have anywhere to be," she said carefully, "when this is over." The kitchen was very quiet. Mrs. Calloway's clock ticked on the mantelpiece. "I'd like you to stay," Emmett said. He said it simply, the way he seemed to say everything important, not embellished, not strategic, just honest. She looked at him for a long time, then she said, "Let's get through this first." But she left her hand under his for another moment before she pulled it back, and that was its own kind of answer. On the third day, things accelerated in a direction neither of them had planned for. Emmett came into the dry goods store in the early afternoon with a normal-looking errand and a very specific look in his eyes that Matilda had learned to read by now as meaning there's something you need to know. Agnes Fleet was in the back sorting a delivery, and they had 60 seconds alone. "Hearst's foreman visited the county clerk this morning," Emmett said, keeping his voice down. "The county clerk is one of the names in Thomas's documents. They were in there a long time." "What does that mean?" "It might mean nothing. It might mean that someone's told Hearst something about the Morgan name." He met her eyes. "I've been very careful, but I can't account for every leak." She absorbed this. "Do we need to move faster?" "Cobb's already gone. There's nothing to move faster." He set down the bag of nails he'd picked up as cover. "What I want is for you to be cautious today. Stay in public. Don't go anywhere alone after dark." "I'm not going to hide," she said, and the steadiness in her voice was the kind that comes from having already decided what you're willing to risk. "I'm not asking you to hide," he said. "I'm asking you to be careful." And then lower, "I don't want anything to happen to you." It was not a thing said in the abstract. It was personal, and it was real, and it landed in her chest like the first warm thing after a long, cold stretch. She felt it move through her, and did what she'd been doing with large feelings her whole adult life. She put it carefully away for later. "Nothing will happen to me," she said. "You either." He left. That evening, the threat became specific. Emmett was at his office when one of his deputies, a young man named Tate, who was one of the two he trusted, came in looking pale and said that word around the saloon was that someone had been asking about a woman named Morgan. Specifically asking whether anyone had seen a woman of that description come in on the last Santa Fe train. Emmett kept his face neutral and his voice level. "Who was asking?" "Don't know," Tate said. "The bartender told me. Someone came in, bought a round, and asked casual-like, 'Stranger, Nobody'd seen him before. Emmett got to Mrs. Calloway's in under 5 minutes, coming through the back alley, and found Matilda already in the kitchen with her jacket on and her carpet bag at her feet, because she had the instincts of someone who'd been in enough uncertain situations to recognize when one was tightening. "I heard," she said before he could speak. "How?" Agnes Fleet's son came running to tell her there was a strange man asking around. Agnes told me. She looked at him. "They're looking for me, Hearst knows, or suspects. You can't stay here," he thought fast. "There's a place outside of town, the old Miller farm, been empty 2 years. I'll take you there tonight. You stay quiet, I manage things here, we wait for the marshal." "I'm not going to sit on an empty farm and wait," she said. "Matilda, Emmett." She said his name with a precision that was not anger but its close relative. "I have been waiting for 8 months. I have given up everything I had to get here. I am not going to disappear now and leave you holding this alone." He looked at her, and some of the professional control in his face shifted into something less managed. "I know that," he said. "I know who you are and what you've done. I also know that if Hearst's people find you here before the marshal acts, everything Thomas worked for and everything you've risked could die with you." He stopped. She waited. "And I cannot let that happen," he said, and the words carried more than their literal weight by several measures. She looked at him for a long moment in the lamplight of Mrs. Calloway's kitchen, and then she picked up her carpet bag and said, "Show me this farm, then." They left Redemption Creek on horseback. Emmett on his own roan gelding and Matilda on a horse he'd borrowed from the livery on a pretext. A steady bay mare that had no trouble with the dark road. They rode out the south end of town under the vast, star-crowded New Mexico sky, and the night smelled of juniper and the particular dry sweetness of high desert in summer. And they didn't talk much on the road because the words they needed weren't the kind that could be said on horseback in the dark, without sounding different than they were meant. The Miller farm was a low adobe structure set back from a rocky creek bed, surrounded by the remnants of what had been a productive kitchen garden, and was now returning to the wild. It was in good enough repair to be habitable and far enough from the road to be inconspicuous. Emmett had ridden out the week before on different business and checked it. He'd been thinking ahead. They brought the horses around to the back where a small linta provided shelter, and then Emmett let them into the house with a key he'd obtained from the county tax office, where the abandoned property was registered, and he lit the one lamp he'd brought in his saddlebag, and they stood in the low-ceilinged main room and looked at each other. "You'll have food," he said. "I'll bring some tomorrow morning early. There's a well out back that was working last time I checked." He was scanning the room with a practical eye. It's fine," she said. "There are blankets in the chest against the wall. I checked those too." He met her eyes. "I'll come every day, I'll bring news." "I know," she said. The lamp put warm gold light on both of them, and the house was very quiet, the desert quiet that is not silence but a different kind of fullness, insects, and the distant call of something small and nocturnal in the particular hush of the night air. "You planned ahead," she said, and there was something soft and wondering in it. "I'm the sheriff," he said. "It's my job to anticipate problems." "It's not just your job," she said. He looked at her, and the professional distance he'd been maintaining all these weeks, the carefully managed distance that kept things workable, that didn't complicate what they were trying to accomplish, folded. It didn't collapse dramatically. It just became no longer structurally necessary, like a temporary wall taken down when the building is done. He crossed the small distance between them and put his hands on either side of her face and said, very quietly, "No, it isn't just my job." She put her hands over his. She was looking up at him with those green eyes that had been cataloging him since the moment on the platform, and she said, "When this is over, I know," he said. He kissed her very gently, the way you kiss someone you want to say something true to, and she kissed him back. And for a long moment in the old Miller farmhouse under the New Mexico stars, with everything uncertain and dangerous and still unresolved, they allowed themselves this one real thing. Then they broke apart and she said, "Go back to town before you're missed." He rested his forehead against hers briefly. "I'll be back in the morning. I'll be here." He rode back to Redemption Creek, with his heart doing something he hadn't felt it do in a very long time, and the stars were enormous overhead, and the desert smelled like the end of summer and the beginning of something new. The next 2 days were the most difficult, because they were the days of waiting, and waiting with high stakes and uncertain timing is one of the worst things a person can endure. Emmett came to the farm each morning and evening, bringing food and news and updates that were mostly the same. Hearst's man was still in town, still asking around. The county clerk had filed some sort of paperwork that Emmett's trusted Deputy Tate was attempting to determine the nature of. There was no word yet from Santa Fe. They talked during these visits in a way that had shifted entirely from the kitchen table strategy sessions of the earlier days, though strategy was still part of it. They talked about other things, his family near Las Cruces, her years managing the farm in Texas, the books she'd read, the places he'd always meant to travel. She showed him more of her drawings, pulled from the small notebook she always kept, and he looked at them with the focused attention he gave to things he found genuinely valuable. She had drawn the church from memory, the platform where they'd met, a portrait of Mrs. Calloway that was effortlessly kind and accurate. "You see people clearly," he said. "Thomas always said I was too observant for my own good," she said, "that I noticed things that were better not noticed. He was wrong about that." "He was right about it being dangerous," she said, but she was smiling. He was finding more reasons to earn that smile. He came to the farm in the evenings with small things, a wildflower from the roadside, a book from the town lending library that he thought she'd like, once a piece of Mrs. Calloway's pie in a folded cloth because he'd told the landlady a friend was staying outside of town, and Mrs. Calloway had asked no questions and sent pie because she understood that kindness was a practical thing. On the fourth morning, the territorial marshal's deputy arrived in Redemption Creek. Emmett was in his office when he came in, a compact, serious man named Deputy Marshal Vigil who presented his credentials and said simply that Marshal Garrett had received a package and was requesting Sheriff Ford's cooperation in an immediate matter of territorial law. Calvin Hearst was to be detained pending formal charges. Emmett had his 2 trusted deputies, Tate and a steady older man named Callum, on notice within the hour. He rode to the Miller farm himself. Matilda was in the yard with the bay mare when he rode in, and she read it in his face before he said anything. She stood very still for a moment, and then she said, "It happened. The marshal's deputy is here. We're going out to Hearst's ranch this afternoon." She took a breath. "I'm coming." "Matilda, I'm a material witness," she said. "Thomas's letter was addressed to the marshal. The evidence is my brother's work. I'm not staying here for this part." He studied her face. He'd known before he rode out here that she would say this, and he'd already decided that she was right. "You ride with me," he said. "You stay close. You let us handle the arrest." Agreed. They rode into Redemption Creek together, and that was the first time the town saw them arrive that way side by side on horseback in the bright afternoon light. Her in her gray dress and riding jacket, him with his badge catching the sun. And anyone who was paying attention would have understood that something had shifted in the nature of whatever connected these 2 people. Deputy Marshal Vigil looked at Matilda Morgan with a professional assessment, and then said he'd read Thomas Morgan's letter to the marshal personally, and that it was one of the most thorough pieces of documented evidence he'd seen in his years of work, and he was sorry for her loss. She thanked him with a dignity that was entirely her own. They rode out to the Crossed H Ranch in the middle of the afternoon. Emmett, his 2 deputies, Deputy Marshal Vigil, and Matilda and Calvin Hearst, came out of his ranch house to meet them on the porch with the confidence of a man who had never had a reason to be afraid of any lawman in this territory. That confidence lasted until Deputy Marshal Vigil read out the charges. What happened in Hearst's face in that moment was not a collapse but an unveiling, the careful, charming surface stripped back to reveal something colder and more calculating underneath, and Matilda watched it happen from 10 feet away on horseback, and felt something that was not quite satisfaction and not quite grief, but contained elements of both. She was thinking about Thomas. She was thinking about all the mornings he'd gotten up before dawn to keep their farm running. About his letters, careful and warm and sometimes funny, that had arrived throughout her adulthood. About the last one, heavy with what he'd found and what he feared, and the fact that he'd hidden the evidence instead of running because Thomas Morgan had believed that right things should be done, and that someone would eventually come to find what he'd left. She had come. Hurst was taken into custody without violence, though not without attempted negotiation. He was the kind of man who believed, right up to the moment the law becomes undeniable, that he can talk his way around any situation. Deputy Marshal Vigil listened politely to everything he said, and then placed him in Emmett's custody for transport to the county seat, where federal charges would be formally filed. The county clerk and the other officials named in Thomas's documents would be dealt with through separate processes that the marshal's office was already setting in motion. The judge at the county seat was a separate, longer problem, but with the documentary evidence Thomas had gathered, it was a problem with a solution. They rode back to Redemption Creek in the long golden light of late afternoon, and Emmett came to ride beside Matilda, and they were quiet for a time in the way of people who have just seen something large and long hoped for come to pass. "He's going to face a jury," she said eventually. "He is," Emmett said. "And with what Thomas documented, that jury is going to know exactly what he did." She nodded. She was looking at the horizon. "Thomas would have been disgusted by the drama of all this," she said. "He always wanted things handled quietly and properly." "This is as proper as it gets," Emmett said. She looked at him then, turned fully in the saddle, and gave him the full force of those green eyes and the smile that went with them when it was real. "Yes," she said, "I suppose it is." The following days were busy in the particular way of official proceedings, documents to file, statements to take, Deputy Marshal Vigil requiring Matilda's formal testimony, which she gave in Emmett's office in a composed, precise recounting that covered everything she knew and everything she'd done to get to Redemption Creek, including the letter from Thomas and the months of investigation. Vigil took her account with respect and a professionalism that, Emmett noticed, occasionally slipped into something close to admiration. Councilman Petrie, upon learning that his name was in Thomas Morgan's documents, immediately developed a strong interest in cooperating with the territorial marshal's office. The county clerk followed. The land fraud cases began to unravel with the methodical certainty of a well-built argument meeting the open air. It was not instantaneous justice. It never is, and Matilda understood this better than most, having seen enough of the territory's complicated systems to have no illusions about the speed of official processes. But it was real, and it was moving, and it was built on Thomas's work, and that mattered more to her than speed. Emmett managed the local work of it, the paperwork, the securing of records, the management of his own office now that it was clear which two deputies had been compromised, both of whom were dismissed and replaced, which was its own uncomfortable process but necessary. He was busy. She was busy. They saw each other in official context during this week, and in passing on the street, and once in the late evening at Mrs. Calloway's kitchen, back at the kitchen table where so much had already happened between them, where they sat with coffee and the quiet aftermath of the most intense week either of them had experienced, and didn't talk much because there was a different quality to the silence between them now. Not the silence of two people working out a strategy, but the silence of two people who had been through something significant together, and were allowing themselves to simply exist in the same space without the pressure of what was coming next. "You should stay," Emmett said, when the clock had counted out a comfortable hour. He wasn't looking at her directly. He was looking at his coffee cup turned in his hands. "In Redemption Creek, there's work here. Agnes Fleet has already asked you properly, I believe." "She has," Matilda said. "She offered me a full position at the store. And Mrs. Calloway said something about wanting a more permanent boarder. She did." A pause. "You've been talking to people." "I've been listening," he said. "It's my job." She smiled at her own coffee cup. "It's not just your job." He looked up then and found her watching him with that particular green-eyed expression that he had no word for yet, but intended to have words for eventually. "No," he agreed. "It isn't. I don't have anything to go back to," she said. "Texas is gone. The farm is gone. Everything I owned is what's in that carpet bag." She said this without self-pity, simply as fact. "I've been thinking about what comes next, and the honest answer is I'd rather think about what comes next here than anywhere else." "Why here?" he asked. He knew the answer, but he wanted to hear her say it. She gave him a look that was amused and honest in equal measure. "Because here is where you are," she said, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. "And you are the least complicated, straightforward, honest person I've met in longer than I can remember, and being near you feels like something I want to keep doing, which is not a feeling I've had very often, and I intend to take it seriously." It was the most direct she'd ever been with him about this, which was saying something, because Matilda Morgan was not an indirect woman. He set down his coffee cup and looked at her with everything he'd been carefully managing in his expression over the past weeks simply allowed to be visible. "I'm also difficult," he said. "I work too much. I take the law personally in a way some people find exhausting. I have opinions about things that I hold very firmly." "I know," she said. "I've spent 3 weeks watching you. I know exactly who you are. And I think you're remarkable," she said simply and completely. "And I'd very much like to stay." He reached across the table and took her hand properly this time, not briefly or tentatively but fully, her hand in both of his, and she held on. "Then stay," he said. She did. The weeks that followed were the ones that Matilda would later describe as the time when Redemption Creek stopped being a destination and became a home. It happened gradually, the way real things do, not a single dramatic moment but an accumulation of small ones. Agnes Fleet's store became hers as much as Agnes's, not formally at first but functionally, because Matilda had an eye for organization and a talent for remembering what customers needed, and she started suggesting small improvements that Agnes immediately adopted. She joined the church, not from any strong theological conviction, but because the community that gathered there on Sunday mornings was warm and real, and because Reverend Hale was a good man who asked nothing of his congregation, except that they try to be decent to each other. She and Emmett began to spend time together in the open, the way courting people do in a small town, walks in the evening after the heat had broken, Sunday dinners at the one restaurant Redemption Creek could claim, long conversations on the bench outside the sheriff's office where the sunset turned everything amber. The town noticed, and the town approved with the unanimous and occasionally overwhelming enthusiasm of a community that was fond of its sheriff, and delighted to see him looking like a man with a reason to smile. Mrs. Calloway in particular took a proprietary delight in the whole thing, which expressed itself in an escalating quality of breakfasts whenever Emmett happened to eat at the boarding house. Thomas's trial, or rather, Calvin Hurst's trial, which took place at the county seat in September of 1882, lasted 9 days. Matilda testified. She sat in the witness chair and answered every question put to her with the same precise control she'd brought to every other difficult thing in her life, and when the prosecuting attorney asked her to identify Thomas's handwriting in the journal, she looked at the pages with her hands folded in her lap and said, "Yes, that is my brother's writing," in a voice that was entirely steady. Emmett was in the courtroom every day. He sat where she could see him if she looked up. She looked up often enough to be sustained. Hurst was convicted on 4 counts of land fraud, conspiracy to commit murder, and complicity in the deaths of Thomas Morgan, and the ranch hand named Decker, who had died the previous spring. The sentence was significant and the verdict was clean, and Thomas Morgan's careful, thorough documentation was cited by the judge as among the most compelling evidence he had encountered in his years on the bench. On the evening of the last day of the trial, after the verdict was delivered and the crowd dispersed, and the official machinery of justice began its grinding next phase, Emmett found Matilda standing in the courthouse yard in the cool September air, looking up at the stars. She'd been composed all day, controlled all week, managing herself through every difficult moment with the discipline she'd developed over years of necessity. He put his arm around her, and she turned her face into his shoulder, and she finally cried. Not dramatically, not loudly. Just a quiet, complete kind of grief that had been waiting its turn behind everything else. That belonged to Thomas and to the 12-year-old girl who'd lost her parents and the 19-year-old boy who'd stepped up to raise her, and all the years that had followed, and the letter she'd memorized, and the journal she'd found under the church floorboards. Emmett held her and didn't say anything because there was nothing to say, and sometimes being present is the whole of what love requires. She pulled back after a while and wiped her face with practical efficiency. "I'm all right," she said. "I know," he said. He would have been glad, she said. He believed in the law meaning something. "So do I," Emmett said. She looked up at him and put her hand against his face, and he leaned into it, and she said, "I know you do. That's one of the things I love about you." It was the first time either of them had used that word. It hung in the cool September night between them, enormous and quiet and entirely right. "I love you," he said, saying it fully and without qualification. "I think I've known it since the church, maybe before." "Since the church," she agreed, "possibly since the platform." She smiled, and it was the real one, the one that appeared without warning and changed the entire quality of the air. "I was terrified of you at first, you know. You knew my name before I said it. I thought it was a trap." "I should have been gentler about that," he said. "No," she said. "You were exactly right. I needed someone who already knew and wasn't afraid of it." She paused. "Someone who could meet me where I was." He kissed her in the courthouse yard under the September stars with his arms around her, and the New Mexico night pressing softly on them from all sides, and it was entirely different from that first careful kiss in the farmhouse. This one unhurried and complete, the kind of kiss that says we made it, and now what about everything that comes next? They married in December of 1882. The wedding was at the Redemption Creek Church, officiated by Reverend Hale, attended by essentially the entire town and a number of people who'd come from outside it for the occasion. Agnes Fleet stood beside Matilda. Emmett's trusted deputy Tate stood beside Emmett. Mrs. Calloway sat in the second pew and wept openly and happily throughout the ceremony, which was short and simple, and exactly as Emmett and Matilda had discussed. They had both, independently, the quality of people who distrust ornament for its own sake and prefer the thing itself. The vows they exchanged were the traditional words, which both of them meant with a completeness that made Reverend Hale, who had officiated at a considerable number of weddings, say afterward to Mrs. Calloway that, in his experience, those particular words only carried their full weight about 1 time in 10, and this had been one of those times. Matilda wore blue, a new dress in the same deep blue of her traveling dress, which Emmett had privately told her was the most beautiful color he'd ever seen her in and which she'd chosen for the wedding without mentioning to him why. He figured it out when he saw her coming down the church aisle, and something passed through his face that made the women in the first 3 pews catch their breath. The reception was at the main restaurant, which the owner had cleared and decorated with the wildflowers of late autumn, and there was music from a fiddle player named Old Pete, who could play all night on 1 glass of whiskey, and whose repertoire extended from hymns to dance tunes with equal skill. Emmett Ford danced with his wife 3 times and spent the rest of the evening unable to keep from watching her, which she pretended not to notice, and which everyone else found entirely charming. They moved into the house that came with the sheriff's position, a small, solidly built adobe on the quieter end of the main street that had been bachelor plain before Matilda got hold of it. Over the next months, she made it into something else without changing its bones, some curtains at the windows, her drawings on the walls, her books mixed in with his on the shelf he'd built himself, her presence in every room filling in the spaces where emptiness had settled over 3 years of a man living alone. He found small things in unexpected places, a wildflower pressed in a book he opened, a sketch of him left on the kitchen table, his coffee already made on the morning she rose before him. She found small things too, a new book appearing on her side of the shelf, the lamp trimmed and ready at her drawing table, a note in his careful handwriting left on her pillow once that said simply, "I thought about you all day," which was 3 words fewer than a love letter should probably be and somehow more effective than the longer version. The territory moved on around them. Hearst's empire in the county unraveled through the autumn and into the winter, as the land fraud convictions unwound years of manipulated records, and a number of small ranchers who'd been pushed off their land found themselves with legitimate legal claims that were, slowly and imperfectly but genuinely, being recognized. It was not a clean or complete restoration. The law rarely offers those. But it was real work being done by real people, and Emmett threw himself into it with the passion he brought to all legal work that he believed in, and Matilda was beside him in the unofficial, practical ways that she'd always operated in helping people navigate paperwork, translating legal language for ranch families who didn't speak the formal vocabulary of courts, remembering everything and organizing it and being, in the language of the thing, invaluable. Deputy Tate was promoted to deputy chief. Agnes Fleet expanded her dry goods store and offered Matilda a partnership, which Matilda accepted after some deliberation and a conversation with Emmett in which he said, entirely characteristically, "It's what you're good at and you love the work, so I don't understand the deliberation." And she'd said, "I was waiting to see if you'd have any objection." And he'd looked genuinely baffled and said, "Why would I have an objection to you being successful?" Which answered the question so thoroughly that she kissed him and accepted Agnes's offer the next morning. In the spring of 1883, Matilda told Emmett she was expecting their first child. He was in the kitchen when she told him, drinking his morning coffee, and she said it plainly without preamble the way she said most things, and his coffee cup stopped halfway to the table, and he looked at her for a moment with something moving through his expression that she would later try to draw from memory and never quite get right because it contained too many things at once. He crossed the kitchen and put his arms around her and held her for a long time, and she could feel his heart beating against her, and he said very quietly into her hair, "This is the best thing." "It is," she agreed. Their son was born in November of 1883, delivered by the town's capable if perpetually harried doctor, with Mrs. Calloway in steady attendance, and Emmett pacing the front room of their house in the focused way he paced when things were out of his control, which Tate, who stayed with him, later described as the most concentrated pacing he'd ever witnessed in 20 years of knowing anxious men. When the doctor came out and said, "You have a healthy boy and your wife is fine and asking for you," Emmett's pacing stopped so abruptly that Tate caught his arm to make sure he didn't fall. He went in. Matilda was propped against the pillows, tired and beautiful and herself, holding a small dark-haired person who was new to the world and already entirely at home in it by the look of things. She looked up at Emmett, and the expression on her face was the one he'd been waiting all his life to see on the face of someone he loved, whole and certain and at peace. "Come meet your son," she said. He sat on the edge of the bed and looked at his son for a long time. The boy had Matilda's coloring, dark auburn hair that would probably lighten, and a grip that, when Emmett extended his finger experimentally, proved to be completely serious about maintaining its claim. "Thomas," Emmett said. He hadn't discussed the name with her. It came out simply, the right word for the right thing. She looked at him and her eyes were bright. "Yes," she said. "Thomas." Thomas George Ford, named for her brother and her father, was a serious, cheerful, thoroughly healthy child who from the first showed a strong interest in everything happening around him and an absolute refusal to be ignored. He was adored by Mrs. Calloway and by Agnes Fleet and by Deputy Tate, who became, functionally if not officially, the child's devoted uncle. He was adored by his parents with the particular intensity of two people who had each been without family for long enough to understand exactly what this meant. Emmett took him to the office with him, sometimes when Matilda needed quiet to do the store accounts, and Thomas sat in the corner with whatever he could find to occupy himself, and watched his father handle the work of the law with the focused attention of someone already learning how the world worked. He was, everyone agreed, the image of his mother in terms of temperament, observant, precise, decisive, with a laugh that appeared when things genuinely surprised him and which Emmett worked entirely consciously to earn. The years moved. The territory changed. New Mexico moved steadily through the processes that would eventually lead it toward statehood, though that was still 3 decades away, and belonged to a future neither Emmett nor Matilda would live to see. What they saw was a county increasingly ordered by actual law rather than the interests of the most powerful local men, and they saw it in part because of what they'd done together in the summer and fall of 1882. The church floorboard was repaired permanently at some point. Reverend Hale had been quietly informed of the role it had played, and had thereafter included it in his occasional meditations on the unexpected instruments through which justice moves. He never used names. Everyone who knew the story understood. Bart Alcott, the former Army surveyor who'd been Thomas's friend and first ally, came through Redemption Creek in the spring of 1884 on his way further south. He stayed 2 days. He and Matilda sat on the front porch of the house on the main street and talked about Thomas for an entire afternoon, trading memories and filling in pieces each had that the other lacked. And Emmett sat nearby doing nothing in particular except being present, understanding that this was important in a way that required no active participation from him. When Alcott left, he shook Emmett's hand and said, "Thomas would have liked you." It was said plainly, and Emmett took it plainly. He had good instincts about people, Alcott added, bad luck but good instincts. He left evidence that held up in court, Emmett said. That's not bad instincts, that's exceptional ones. Alcott nodded. Yes, he said, it was. In the fall of 1885, their second child arrived, a daughter they named Clara, from Matilda's mother, a dark-eyed, determined child who had her father's jaw and her mother's precision, and who would, as she grew, prove entirely capable of keeping her older brother in line through the sheer force of a personality that managed to be both warm and absolutely implacable simultaneously. Thomas and Clara and the small house on the main street, and the store that Matilda ran with Agnes Fleet, and the work that Emmett did year after year in service of the law the way he believed it should be. This was the life. Not in the diminished sense of merely existing, but in the full sense of a life built deliberately out of things that mattered, by two people who had each come to it from loss and difficulty, and who knew, with the knowledge that only comes from contrast, how remarkable ordinary good days actually are. On a morning in the autumn of 1886, Emmett was in his office when Matilda came in. Not usual. She very rarely came to the office in the mornings, respecting the professional space the way they'd tacitly agreed to respect each other's domains. She came in and she had the look she got when something had struck her that she'd been thinking about. "What?" he said. "Thomas asked me something this morning," she said. "He asked me why you became a sheriff. What do you tell him when he asks that?" Emmett thought about it. Thomas was almost 3 and in the phase of asking the reason behind everything, which was both exhausting and, Emmett privately thought, a sign of excellent character. "I told him," Emmett said, "that somebody has to make sure things are fair." Matilda nodded slowly. "That's a good answer." "It's the true one," he said. He leaned back in his chair, looking at her. "Did he accept it?" He wanted to know who made sure the person making sure things were fair was fair themselves, she said. "He's 3. Emmett smiled, and it was the full smile, the one he'd rarely used before she'd come to Redemption Creek, and that now appeared frequently enough that it had changed something in the set of his face, loosened it, made it approachable in a way that he hadn't particularly been before. "What did you tell him?" I told him people like his father, Matilda said. People who take it personally. He got up from behind the desk and came to her, and she met him halfway, and he put his hands on either side of her face exactly as he had that first time in the Miller farmhouse, and she put her hands over his exactly as she had then. I still can't believe you came off that train, he said. I still think about that. You frightened me half to death, she said. I know. I've been trying to make up for it. 4 years of excellent effort, she said, mock serious. You're making progress. He kissed her, unhurried, the way he'd long since learned was his preferred kind, the kind that had nothing to hurry toward because everything worth being was already here. She kissed him back and put her arms around his neck, and they stood there in the morning light of the sheriff's office of Redemption Creek, New Mexico, 4 years and a great deal of living past a train platform and a name said before it could be spoken. Out on the main street, the town went about its day. A wagon rolled past carrying lumber. Old Pete the fiddle player was, by the sound of it, already in the saloon, which was early even for him. Mrs. Calloway's tabby cat was doing its morning patrol of the boardwalk. Agnes Fleet's store had its door propped open, and the smell of fresh coffee drifting out. In the house down the street, Thomas Ford was almost certainly doing something that would require explaining later, and Clara Ford was almost certainly watching him do it with the expression of judicial neutrality she had recently developed. And Emmett Ford and Matilda Morgan Ford stood in the morning light of the town that had brought them together through the instrument of a name known before it was spoken, and the distance between them was none at all. Later that afternoon, Emmett came home early, not a usual occurrence, but Tate had things handled and the day was quieter than most, and he had, he told himself, no particular reason to be at the office when there was a better place to be. He found Matilda at the kitchen table with her drawing notebook and a cup of tea, and both children were apparently napping, and the house had the particular suspended quality of a rare midday quiet. She looked up when he came in. Early, she observed. Tate's capable, he said, sitting down across from her. What are you drawing? She turned the notebook toward him. It was a drawing of the main street of Redemption Creek, done with her usual quick accuracy, the store fronts, the church in the background, the hitching posts, the particular quality of afternoon light. In the foreground, barely indicated, 2 figures walking together. She'd caught something in the posture of them, some quality of being at ease in each other's presence, that was more effective than any amount of careful detail. Us, he said. When you walked me from the platform to Mrs. Calloway's, she said. The first day, he looked at it. You looked terrified of me, he said. I remember you thought I was a trap. You looked terrifying, she said. You had your share of face on. I always have my share of face on, he said. Not always, she said, and the quality of the smile she gave him was the particular one that said she knew something about him that he didn't fully know himself, which was one of the things about her that had always undone him entirely. He reached across the table and tucked a loose strand of her auburn hair back, a simple gesture that had become natural over years of the same simple gestures, and she leaned into it the way she leaned into everything from him, not with need but with the particular ease of someone who is fully safe. Thank you, he said. For what specifically? She asked. For getting on that train, he said. For coming here. For not letting the name I knew stop you from figuring out whether I was worth trusting. She considered him with those green eyes for a moment, with all the consideration she'd been bringing to bear on him since the very first moment on the platform. You always were, she said, worth trusting. You couldn't have known that. I know what Thomas always said, she replied. He said that when you're afraid and the person in front of you looks at you like you're a person and not a problem, that's someone worth betting on. She picked up her pencil again. You looked at me like a person, even when you were afraid of what I represented. I was afraid of that, he admitted. I know, she said. And you came and picked up my bag anyway. He laughed, a short, genuine sound that filled the kitchen, and she smiled at her drawing, and the afternoon light moved through the windows, and somewhere down the street the fiddle had started playing something slow and comfortable, and in two of the back rooms of the house 2 small children slept the absolute sleep of small children who have been thoroughly busy and are now thoroughly at rest. This was Redemption Creek in the autumn of 1886, and this was Emmett Ford and Matilda Morgan Ford, who had arrived at each other through betrayal and hidden motives and a dark past and a forbidden truth and all the machinery of danger and necessity, and had made, out of all of that and despite all of that, something ordinary and warm and real and completely, wholly their own. The name she'd arrived with, the name he'd known before she spoke, had been in the end not just a warning. It had been the beginning of everything. Thomas Morgan's name had carried the weight of grief and injustice across the territory and had arrived, finally, in the right place, in the right hands, and had done what Thomas had always believed the truth could do if it reached someone clean. It had set things right. And in the setting right of things, two people had found each other in the particular way that happens when you are stripped of everything ordinary and left with only what is essential. And what is essential turns out to be a person who already knew your name. Thomas George Ford learned to read at 4 and was insufferably proud of the fact. Clara Ford at 2 could already communicate a fairly complex range of instructions through expression alone, a skill she would refine to an art form over the following decades. Emmett Ford continued to take the law personally and to be, in the opinion of the county and eventually the territory, one of the most reliable sheriffs in the region. Matilda Morgan Ford ran the best dry goods store in 3 counties, raised 2 extraordinary people, drew the life around her with the clarity of someone who understood exactly how lucky it was to have one, and loved her husband with the particular precision she brought to everything she valued, completely, deliberately, and without reservation. They grew old in Redemption Creek. The town grew around them, adding houses and a school and eventually a second church, and a small newspaper that Matilda occasionally wrote for under her own name on subjects of practical importance to the community. Emmett retired from the badge when Thomas was grown and took it up again briefly when the man who'd replaced him proved inadequate and the town asked, and then retired again when Thomas, who had grown into a man with his mother's eyes and his father's jawline, and something entirely his own in the specific quality of his concern for fairness, took the position at 23 and proved immediately and permanently excellent at it. On the evening that Thomas Ford was sworn in as sheriff, Emmett and Matilda sat on the front porch of the house that had been theirs for 20 years, and Emmett had his arm around her and she had her head on his shoulder, and they watched the lights of the main street and the church steeple against the late sky, and neither of them said anything for a long time. Then Matilda said, "Thomas would have loved this. Her brother. He understood who she meant." "Yes," Emmett said, "he would have." She turned her face up to him in the old way, the way she'd turned it up on the courthouse yard and in the farmhouse and on the porch of countless evenings and in every room of their shared life. The years had changed them, not diminished, but deepened, the way good materials deepen when they've been through enough. "We did right by him," she said. "We did," Emmett agreed. She reached up and touched his face, and he caught her hand and held it, and the stars came out over Redemption Creek in all their high desert extravagance, and the world was wide and mostly good, and everything that had been broken had been made, if not whole, then at least honest, and what had been hidden had come to light, and what had been lost had been, in the ways that matter most, honored. The name she'd carried across the territory, the name he'd known before she could speak it, it belonged now to both of them in different ways and in the best way. It belonged to a grave properly marked in the Redemption Creek Cemetery with a headstone that read Thomas George Morgan, 1854–1881, whose work and testimony brought justice to this county. It belonged to a boy grown into a man wearing a badge. It belonged to the church with the fixed floorboard and the drawing on Matilda's wall and the letter preserved in the territorial marshal's records in Santa Fe. It belonged, most of all, to the 2 people who had picked it up together when the world had offered it to them as either a trap or a gift, and who had chosen to believe it was the latter, and had been right.